Welcome to the series Wisecracks by Dr. Gerald Mann. Dr. Mann is the senior pastor at the Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. Let's join Dr. Mann for more of Wisecracks.
I've been preaching a series of sermons called Wisecracks, Little Windows of Wisdom into Living Well from the book of Proverbs. I've enjoyed this more than I ever dreamed I would. I hope you have too. Today, we're going to look at Proverbs 14:10. The name of the sermon is Things I Tell Only to God. Things I tell only to God. And the proverb reads, every heart has its own bitterness and its own joy, which no one else can share. Things I tell only to God. Two grandparent stories. I was on a plane going to Denver. There was a couple of grandparents who had a beautiful, cherubic little 3-year-old boy with golden ringlets and blue eyes. And by the time we got to Denver, he had absolutely terrorized the entire cabin of the airplane. He was crawling in and out of people's feet. He was knocking over things. He was getting into drinks, knocking newspapers around. And his grandparents were following around behind him with that, oh, isn't that cute look on their face. And, you know, by the time we got to Denver, everybody on the airplane wanted to lock him in one of those overhead bins, except the grandparents, and they were just beaming. And I remembered that scripture, every heart has its own joys which no one else can share. Another grandparent story, the last time I visited with my grandmother who had meant so much to me in my life, she was the one who gave me the gift of delight when I was a child. I always felt like the waif looking in the window at Christmas time, and that may have been well-founded or not, but that's the way I felt, and she sensed that, and she made me her special project. She introduced me to Christ. She introduced me to reading. She introduced me to so many wonderful things and spent hours with me, and when she was 87, she said, I'm blind, and I won't be able to talk lucidly very much longer, so I would like for you to come and let's have a good visit. So I went and sat down and spent a half a day with her, and we reminisced about all the things the joys and the thanks of life. And at one point I said to her, tell me about Papa Mann, her husband. They had been separated for over 40 years. She had never spoken his name to me at all. She clammed up and said, no, we will not talk about that. And I said, well, you need to talk about that. And I want to know because my father told me that your husband was abusive, he was an alcoholic, and that after one particularly abusive incident, you miscarried, and that was when you finally separated. And she said, if you want to keep talking about that, you can leave. I will not talk about it. I said, why? We're so close. She said, because there's some things I tell only to God. Because God is the only one who can do anything about it. It says in the proverb, every heart has its own joys and its own sorrows, which nobody else can share. Talking to Gordon Smith this morning about his mom. His dad passed away last week and been married over 60 years. And we were talking about the fact that in spite of all the support and all the love you can give a person, each of us has to go through our own grief. At some point, we have to face that alone. There are some things I tell only to God. And I want to speak about that this morning in general categories, okay? I share with God, only God, my profound loneliness. You wouldn't know it by looking at me, but I'm a very lonely person. I've always been that way. I've always felt like people didn't understand me. I've always had a great need for people to love me. And that's the reason that I'm always in a hurry. I was coming home the other day from vacation, and I was driving like a bat out of Hades, and I thought, I have 10 hours to get home. Why am I going so fast? I'm always afraid I'm going to miss something, that I've missed out on life, and that's the reason I rush everywhere I go. I have a need to talk all the time and be the center of attention. I get ready to go to a party, and I promise myself I am going to be quiet. I'm going to listen to what everybody else has to say. I'm going to be interested in them. I'm going to ask about their kids and their grandkids and their dogs and their paper route and the whole deal, but I am not going to talk. I can be there 15 minutes, and I'm in the middle of the room with a lampshade on my head doing bird calls. That comes from this profound sense of estrangement that I've always had. But there's no need in my telling you about that because you cannot do one thing about it. Only God can fill that void of loneliness that we all... See, I have a suspicion that everybody in this room and everybody watching on television all over America has that same sense of estrangement. Philosophers called it existential loneliness. To be a human being, to exist, is to be lonely. And only God can fill that void. If you're trying to get somebody else to fill it, you're in for a bad, bad time. Because only God can do that. And He does. There's a great old hymn we sing entitled The Love of God. There was a man who was in an asylum for the insane for almost 40 years in an 8-by-10 room with a toilet and a lavatory and one little bed and a table. And when he died and the custodians went to clean out his room and they removed the bed from the wall, etched on the wall were the last verse of that hymn, The Love of God. You know it? Could we with ink the ocean fill? And were the skies of parchment made? Were every stalk on earth a quill and every man a scribe by trade? To fathom the love of God. I can't get the last line. Well, every man a scribe by trade. To write the love of God above would drain the ocean dry, nor could the scroll contain the whole, though stretched from sky to sky. It's the third service, I'm sorry. But the point is still there, even though I botched the line. And that is that here is a man who you would think would be the loneliest man in the world, but the love of God could find him in that place. And the same is true for you. There are things I tell only to God. One is my profound loneliness because only He can do anything about it. I tell only God about my deepest doubts. I've seen many miracles in my life. I've seen lives change. I look here on Sunday morning and I see recovering alcoholics and drug addicts. I met some of you when you had the shakes and didn't know where you would go next, and your lives have been put back together. I've seen so many redeemed people over the years. You would think I would never have a single doubt about the existence of God and the love of God and the comfort of God. But I do. There's sometimes I wonder if maybe I invented God just to keep from having to face the awful truth that I'm alone in this world. I have to tell you, I am not like the preachers who say, I know without a doubt, 1,000%, if I died right now in an instant, I would be in heaven with God tomorrow. And if you don't have that same assurance, you are lost. If that's true, I must be lost. I believe with all my heart that it's true. I'm staking my life on it. But I don't know that that's true because I hadn't died yet and I hadn't been to see. Now, maybe there's somebody else here today who has those same lurking doubts. I can only tell God about those because you can't do anything about it. Only God can remove those doubts. And from time to time, He does. One of my favorite stories is about the little boy who decided he would fly a kite higher than any kite had ever been flown in history. He wanted to get in the Guinness Book of World Records. And he got, I don't know how much string, but he got this kite and the wind was blowing and the kite climbed higher and higher and it got so high he couldn't see it. He was sitting there on the beach and a guy walked by and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm flying a kite." He said, "Where is it?" And he said, "It's up there." And the guy said, "Where?" And he said, "It's up there." He said, "Well, where up there?" He said, "I can't see it. It's too high." He said, "Well, how do you know it's still there?" He said, "Every once in a while, I feel a little tug on my finger." And that's my pilgrimage with God. I do have doubts, but every once in a while, I feel a little tug on my finger. I tell only God about my loneliness and my doubts. And I tell only God about what I call my sick sins. My sick sins are those that keep showing up again. Do you have any of those? I'm not going to tell you what they all are. But they just won't go away. I tell myself I'm never going to do them again, and I do them. I tell myself I'll do something and I don't do it. Lest you think I'm some sort of freak, Paul had the same problem. Read Romans 7. The very things I promised God I'm going to do, I don't do. The very things I promised God I'll never do again, I do them. And then he draws a graphic image of being bound up like a mummy with a corpse. He said, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who will separate me from this corpse, this body of death, named Paul?" I have 6 sins, pathological things that just keep jumping back up. Let me give you just one little hint. I have a hard time letting stories stand on their own. I just feel like stories need to be embellished. Need to put a little hair on them for some reason. I know some very good stories that'll manage quite well by themselves, but I feel this inclination to keep adding to them. And I don't know what, it's pathological. I say I'm not going to do it, and I do it. Last Father's Day, I told this story about Dwight L. Moody, the great evangelist, who was 7 years of age, and he walked by his father's study, and his father was on his knees praying. And Moody, as a small child, heard his father pray, and it had a profound impact on his life. And he said, as great as I thought my father was, for him to be on his knees praying to God changed my life. I thought, wow, God must be somebody. A couple of weeks after that was on the air, all over America, I got a letter from the archivist at the Dwight L. Moody Institute in Chicago. He said, "I'd like to inform you that Moody's father died when he was 4 years of age. He was an alcoholic, and Moody hardly ever knew him." That troubled. And he said, "And you preachers never rectify your whoppers on television." Well, I started looking. I knew I'd heard that story. And I kept digging and digging. I dug for 2 months. I finally found the story. It was told by Harry Emerson Fosdick about an unnamed man. I know what I did. I remembered the story, and it's a great story. But I couldn't remember who it was about, and I thought, well, Dwight Moody will do. And so there, Mr. Archivist, I've told the truth, and I'm going to hell, and you can too. I'm kidding. I'm kidding, okay. My integrity is very important to me. And I really don't make any excuses. I didn't authenticate the source. I have that nagging thing that just jumps back up. But you can't do anything about that. Only God can deal with those repetitive, pathological sins that jump up in our lives. Maybe you're a fixer. Maybe you're a dominator. Maybe you're somebody who gets by whining. I mean, whatever it is, we all have those pathologies. And only God can do anything about those. I was reading Isaiah 53:5 the other day, and it spoke to me in a way it never has. I read it for many years. It says, He, God in Christ, He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities, our pathologies. He was chastised for the sake of our peace. And by His stripes are we healed. On Judgment Day, none of us has a thing to say for ourselves. We'll be there naked before God with all of our pathologies, whatever that symbolism means. And the only thing we have to rely upon is the fact that He was wounded and bruised and chastised, and He was striped so that you and I can be free. There's some things I can tell only to God. And one of them are those 6 sins. My loneliness, my doubts, my 6 sins. I can tell only God about what I call my haunting hurts. Haunting hurts are those that I think I've dealt with and buried forever, and they won't stay gone. Do you have any hurts like that? I do. And I think I've processed them, and I think I'm free of them. They jump back up. I'm anticipating our moving into the Home for Hope. And one of the great sadnesses of my life is that my father will not be here to see it. When we moved from the schoolhouse to this great facility, we started Riverbend with 60 people, some debt, some dirt, and some dreams. That's what we started with. And we had 400 the last Sunday in the schoolhouse. We moved here and we had 1,600 show up. And it was in all the newspapers all over the country. We had Willie Nelson here, and that made all the national news. And the day before we had our grand opening, all of the men in my family were at my house. And they all went home and didn't come to the opening. And that really hurt me because I felt like it was sort of my crowning achievement in life. They had no idea that they hurt my feelings. They loved me dearly. They didn't know. I wasn't building this church for my own aggrandizement. I was building it for the glory of God. And I kept telling myself all of that, and I processed it and processed it. And the other day, when I was thinking about moving into the great new worship facility, I thought about that, and it hurt just as much now as it did 12 years ago. There are some hurts that I can tell only to God, because only God can do something about them. Only God can remove them. I had the privilege of meeting Terry Anderson. Anderson was the longest held hostage in the Lebanon by the Arabs, the journalist. And I introduced him, and I had at a conference, and I had the opportunity to meet him and visit with him. During the question and answer, he was asked if he forgave his captors because they were extremely cruel to him. And they asked him if he forgave his captors. He said, as a Christian, he's a devout Catholic, he said, as a Christian, I am required to forgive. But as a human being, I have to do it over and over and over and over again. And I liked his honesty because he was telling my story, and I think he was telling yours. There's some things I tell only to God because only God can do anything about them. My loneliness, my doubts, my sins, and my hurts. And so you see, you and I have two choices. If you're trying to cover those things on your own or get somebody else to take those away, you're in for a big disillusionment because only God can do that. And God will do that. When I was a little boy living in the 5th Ward in Houston in little row houses, we all had a concrete porch. And on Saturday, we could hear a bell ringing. It wasn't the ice cream man. He came later. But early in the morning on Saturday, there was a man who had a wagon and a mule. And a mule had a bell on it. That's what we heard. And he would come down the middle of our street, and we called him the fixin' man. If you had scissors that needed sharpening or knives, or if you had a broken fan or a broken iron or whatever it was, he had the tools to fix it. And people would take what was broken, and they would put a tag on it and put their name and what was wrong, and they would place it on the front porch. And the fixing man would come by and pick it all up, and the next week he would bring it back, repaired. We called him the fixing man. I was thinking about him the other day, and there's a strong symbolism in that. Jesus Christ is our fixing man. If you could only take those things that you can't tell to anybody else, your loneliness, your hurts, your sins, all of those things, and if you could write what they are on a tag and put them out on the front porch of your life and invite God to come and take them and fix them, what a difference it would make in your life and mine. I invite you to do that this week, to take all of those hurts and doubts and sins and things that you've been carrying all these years and write your name on them and describe what they are and put them on the front porch of your life and give them to the only one who can make a difference and repair them and make you a new person, the fixing man. Things I tell only to God because only God can do anything about them. My highest hope for you is that you could put those hurts and those sins on the front porch and let Jesus Christ have them.
Thank you for joining us for the series Wisecracks. For information on other audio tapes or books by Dr. Gerald Mann, please call 1-800-388-9500. or write to Gerald Mann Ministries, P.O. Box 842076, Dallas, Texas 75284. You can now select the next tape in this series from Dr. Gerald Mann.